The girl arrived at the throne room's threshold on the first night of winter, when the wind howled through Valdres like a wounded beast seeking its lair. She was barely 17, small-boned and hollow-cheeked, dressed in the mud-caked remnants of a traveling cloak that had once been fine gray wool. The guards at the door were old men, too old for war, too tired for anything but slow death. They did not stop her. Perhaps they were too cold, too hungry, too broken to care. Or perhaps they recognized something in her face that made their hands fall away from their rusted blades. She was Kaelindra Valdren, the last of a line of kings that stretched back 11 generations to the first emperor who had sat upon the Obsidian Throne and been remade by it. Her great-grandfather had been the third to sit upon the throne, and the last to survive the sitting, if survival was what he had done. In those final hours, when his screams had echoed through the castle for all to hear, his body had been found not dead, but emptied, a husk of skin and bone with eyes that still burned with someone else's will. Kaelindra had grown up in hiding. Her mother had taken her to the eastern swamps when she was 3 years old, after the warlord Korath the Red had sacked the capital and claimed the northern provinces in the name of no king, no god, no law, but his own appetite. In the swamps, her mother taught her to read the old books, to speak in the tongue of courtiers, to remember the shape of a kingdom that existed now only in memory and in the fevered dreams of those who still whispered the old words. And in those books, Kaelindra found the truth of the Obsidian Throne. It was not merely a seat of power. The throne was a living thing, or something that had once been living, before the first emperor performed the rite of binding and chained an old god's hunger to the black stone. The throne fed on the blood of those who ruled. In return, it gave them dominion over all who could see its shadow, armies that would not break, kingdoms that would not fall, a voice that bent the wills of lesser men as fire bends the wax of candles. But the price was total. The throne did not share, it consumed, and those who sat upon it, generation after generation, had eventually been consumed in return. The last entry in her mother's journal, written in a shaking hand the night before she died of the marsh fever, had been simple. Do not sit upon it. Do not. I have seen what waits for those who sit. I have seen. The entry ended there. Kaelindra never learned what her mother had seen. She walked through the ruined great hall now, her footsteps echoing off stone that had once been white marble and was now gray with ash and age. The ceiling had partially collapsed decades ago, and snow drifted in through the broken rafters, piling in cold drifts against the walls. The great chandeliers that had once blazed with 1,000 candles hung dark and tilted, their chains rusted to near breaking. And at the far end of the hall, upon a dais of 3 steps, sat the Obsidian Throne. It was not large. That surprised her every time she saw it in her mind's eye, and it surprised her now. She had imagined something enormous, something terrible in its mass. But the Obsidian Throne was a simple thing. A high-backed chair carved from a single block of volcanic glass so dark it seemed to drink the light. The armrests were worn smooth by centuries of desperate gripping. The seat was stained with something dark that would not scrape away, and it was whispering. She had expected that from the books, but the books had not prepared her for the sound of it. Not a voice exactly, but a pressure, a weight of meaning that pressed against the inside of her skull like a thumb pressing against a soap bubble. It said, "Come, sit. You are the last. The blood is thinned, but it runs in you. Come and claim what is yours." Kaelindra stopped at the foot of the dais steps. Her hand went to the knife at her belt. A small thing, a cook's blade, all she had been able to afford when she'd sold her mother's last necklace in a village 2 days' walk south. It was not much of a weapon, but it was sharp, and she had learned from the swamp folk how to put a blade where it would end a life quickly. She was not here to sit. She was here to burn. The books had been clear. The rite of binding that the first emperor had performed could not be undone by any power in the mortal world. The old god was chained to the throne and would remain chained until the throne itself was destroyed. But there was another way. In the oldest text, the one her mother had guarded most jealously, written in a language that predated even the empire, there was a passage that spoke of the throne's one weakness. The throne could not tolerate a sovereign who did not want to rule. The rite of binding was built on the assumption that every heir would desire the throne, would crave its power, would sit upon it willingly. That desire was the chain that held the old god prisoner. But if someone of royal blood were to approach with no desire, no ambition, no hunger, no need to possess, and were to perform the Counter-Rite using nothing but the blood that was already in them, the throne would find no purchase, no hand to grip, no seat to fill. The old god would be denied, and the throne would die. Kaelindra climbed the 3 steps slowly. The whispers grew louder with each step, shifting from pressure to sound, a low susurrus like wind through dead leaves, like water over sharp stones, like the last breath of a dying man who still has something left to say. You could rule, the throne said, not in words, but in certainty. You could avenge your mother. You could reclaim the kingdom. You could make them all pay for what they have done. Sit, and it is yours. No, Kaelindra said aloud. Her voice was steady. I don't want your kingdom. I don't want your power. I want you gone. She drew the knife. The throne screamed. Not with sound, with meaning, with force, with a sudden violence of will that drove her to her knees and sent cracks spiderwebbing through the stone floor. The air around the dais turned cold, then hot, then cold again. The snow that had drifted through the broken ceiling boiled into steam, and then froze into a halo of ice crystals that hung in the air like a crown. Kaelindra drove the knife into the meat of her own palm. The pain was immediate and blinding. She had cut deep, deeper than she had intended, and her vision whited out at the edges. But she did not stop. She pressed her bleeding hand against the surface of the obsidian armrest, and she spoke the words her mother had made her memorize before she could walk. Words in a language that predated human speech. Words that were not words, but shapes. The shapes of refusal, of emptiness, of a vessel that offers nothing to be filled. The throne fought. It fought with memories, her mother's face, twisted into something monstrous, screaming that Kaelindra had abandoned her, that she had let the warlords win, that she would die alone in the mud like the worthless creature she was. It fought with visions, armies of the dead rising to serve her, Korath the Red kneeling at her feet, the whole kingdom bowing before a queen who wore the crown of stars. It fought with hunger, a hunger so vast and so old that it dwarfed her entirely, a hunger that had swallowed emperors and gods, and would swallow her too if she let it, a hunger that promised to make her part of something eternal, something beyond the small and pitiful boundaries of a single mortal life. Kaelindra held on to the knife. She held on to the pain. She held on to the one thing the throne could not corrupt and could not consume, the simple, furious, absolute refusal to play the game any longer. She did not want to be a queen. She did not want to rule. She did not want power or vengeance or the satisfaction of watching her enemies suffer. She wanted only to end the cycle, to close the door, to make the old god's meal stop. And in the end, after hours or minutes or days, she would never be sure which, the throne ran out of things to offer, and Kaelindra ran out of blood. She collapsed at the foot of the dais, her hands still pressed against the armrest, her lifeblood pooling in the grooves of the ancient stone. The last thing she heard before she lost consciousness was not the throne's voice, but its silence, a silence so complete and so final that it was almost a sound in itself. The old guards found her 3 days later when they finally worked up the courage to enter the great hall and see what the screaming had been about. The throne was gone. Where it had stood on the dais, there was only a pile of fine black dust, ash that swirled in the drafts from the broken ceiling, that settled and scattered and refused to be gathered. It looked like the ash of any ordinary fire, and yet it was heavier than it should have been. When the guards scooped it into their palms, it was warm, as if something inside it was still burning, still refusing to die. They carried Kaelindra out of the hall and laid her by a fire in what had once been the kitchens. A herbalist from the village was summoned, a woman who knew the old ways, who had heard the legends, who looked at the girl with something between fear and awe. "She'll live," the herbalist said after a long examination. "But she's lost a deal of blood. She'll be weak for a time. And the dreams," the herbalist paused, frowning, "she'll have dreams. Something touched her. Something tried to drink her dry. It didn't succeed, but it tried. That leaves marks." Kaelindra woke on the 5th day to gray winter light streaming through a window that had been repaired with rough boards. The pain in her hand was dull and distant, wrapped in poultices and bandages. She flexed her fingers and found that they still worked. She had not lost the hand, though it would carry the scar for the rest of her life. The old guards brought her food, thin broth, stale bread, a few strips of dried meat that might once have been pork. They did not bow, they did not kneel. They looked at her with uncertainty, with wariness, with the fragile hope of men who had forgotten what hope felt like. "The throne," she said. Her voice was a croak. "Is it gone?" said the older guard. His name was Torvin, and he had served 3 kings before the kingdom fell. "Whatever you did, girl, it's gone. The dust is all that's left." Kaelindra closed her eyes. She should have felt triumph. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt only an enormous, crushing exhaustion, and beneath it something that might have been grief. She had not wanted to destroy the throne. She had not wanted to end the bloodline, the kingdom, the 11 generations of history that had led to this single moment. She had simply wanted to stop the wheel from turning, and now the wheel was stopped, and she did not know what to do with the silence. They say that Kaelindra Valdren ruled Valdres for 30 years after that, not as a queen, but as something smaller and stranger. She called herself a steward. She refused the crown. She tore down the dais and scattered the throne's dust in the eastern marshes where she had grown up. She built a small cottage on the site of the old great hall, and she tended a garden where the marble floors had cracked and crumbled. The warlords came in the early years. Korath the Red and his sons, and the Lord of the Iron Coast, and a dozen others who smelled weakness and circled like carrion birds. Kaelindra met them at the gates with nothing but the knife she still carried. The same knife, refitted with a new handle, its blade worn thin from years of use. None of them attacked. They looked at her, this small, scarred woman who stood in the ruins of her ancestors' kingdom and did not flinch. And they saw something that gave them pause. Not power, not threat. Something else. Something that had no name. They retreated. One by one, over the course of a single winter, they retreated to their own territories and declared them independent and left Valdres alone. Perhaps they were afraid of what she had done to the throne. Perhaps they saw her as a fool too insignificant to bother with. Perhaps some deeper instinct, some animal wisdom told them that the woman in the ruined hall was not worth killing. Kaelindra lived out her years in the cottage. She grew herbs and vegetables. She taught the children of the village to read. She never married, never bore children, let the Valdren line end with her, not in tragedy, but in quiet exhaustion. The last ember of a fire that had burned too hot for too long and had finally, mercifully, gone out. And on the wall of her cottage, where the light of the setting sun fell through the one good window, she hung a single painting, not of the throne, not of the kingdom, but of a small gray bird she had seen in the marshes as a child, sitting on a dead branch, singing a song that no one was there to hear. The last light in a dark world. The end.